On July 25th, 1969, Bobby Beausoleil, Susan Atkins, and Mary Bruner went to a house that was nicknamed the Spiral Staircase. So they went to visit Gary Hinman, who was a man that actually helped the Manson family multiple times in the past in various ways. Some sources state that Charles Manson was under the impression that Gary Hinman had inherited some money, and others state that the idea was to take Gary's assets. Other sources state that Bobby Beausoleil was trying to get a refund back from Gary because Gary had sold him some bad drugs. Susan Atkins' book stated that Charlie told the group the need for money was great. Bobby, Mary, and Susan went to Gary's house, and he actually greeted them with a smile. Gary allowed them in, and they talked for a bit until Bobby told Gary that he knew Gary had money. Gary denied this, but he offered some cash he had. In Susan Atkins' book, she stated that Bobby reached out from under his shirt and pulled out a .22 revolver, though in George Stimson's book it was like a 9mm, so Bobby apparently exclaimed, "You don't understand, we want your money." And so Gary stood up and then a fight ensued. Bobby punched Gary in the mouth and fired the gun once, shooting some cabinets. The two then wrestled until Gary was able to grab the gun, and he actually held it on the three. But then he gave the gun back to Bobby because he said he didn't believe in violence, and he wanted to be left alone. From there, Bobby tried to persuade Gary to give them the money, and Gary insisted that he didn't have any. Eventually, Bobby called for Manson to come, and he did, with a sword. Not long after, Manson sliced Gary's face and then left in one of Gary's cars. Mary and Susan were then to have taken some dental floss and stitched Gary's wound. The group stayed in Gary's house for about 3 days, and in Susan's book she said that they took speed and they kept watch on him so he wouldn't leave. On the 3rd day, Gary signed over the papers to his cars under threat from Bobby. Later that day, Bobby stated that he had to kill Gary. Bobby stabbed Gary to death and then wrote "Political Piggy" on the wall in Gary's blood. The idea was for police to think that the murder was done by the Black Panthers. Gary's body wasn't found until July 31st, decaying and decomposed. Bobby took Gary's Fiat, but the car actually broke down not long after that. So, 2 patrolmen actually saw this and they pulled up, and that is when Bobby Beausoleil was arrested. He was eventually convicted of Gary's murder and sentenced to life in prison. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson told Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and Susan Atkins to gather some dark clothes, a knife, and get in a car. The women were told to do whatever Tex told them to, and according to court transcripts, Susan Atkins told a ranch hand at Spawn Ranch that they were going to get some effing pigs. Before leaving the ranch, Manson told the group in the car window to leave something witchy. The group ended up at 10,050 Cielo Drive, the house where Terry Melcher used to live. At the time, it was being rented out by Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon, whose acting name was Sharon Tate. Roman was out of the country at the time recording a movie, and Sharon had came back home as she was 8.5 months pregnant. At the house, she was accompanied by Wojtek Frykowski, a friend of Roman's, and Abigail Folger, who was in a relationship with Wojtek. Also there was Jay Sebring, who had previously been in a relationship with Sharon, but supposedly they were just friends. The Manson group drove to the residence, got out the car, and cut the telephone wires. As they crept through the driveway, a car showed up, which was driven by Stephen Parent. Tex Watson sliced him and then shot him to death. The group moved onto the house, one entering through a window and then coming through the front door to let in the rest. Linda Kasabian stayed outside to keep watch. The other 3 round up everybody in the house, and a frenzy of murder ensued. Patricia Krenwinkel brutally stabbed, chased, tackled, and killed Abigail Folger, though Tex Watson stabbed her too. Wojtek Frykowski was stabbed in the legs by Susan Atkins, but he was also, of course, stabbed by Tex Watson and bludgeoned in the head with a gun butt. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed by Tex. Sharon was, by all accounts, the last to die, and she begged for her baby. Various sources have stated that Susan Atkins told her somewhere along the lines of, "Shut up," or "Shut up, bitch. I have no feelings for you. You're going to die." Sharon was then stabbed repeatedly. Her unborn child was not harmed. After the murders, Susan Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. On the late evening of August 9, 1969, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca returned to their home on Waverly Drive after being out at Lake Isabella. They returned home in the early hours of August 10th, around 1 a.m. As they wound down, Tex Watson and Charles Manson entered their home. They were held at gunpoint and Leno was tied up. The couple were initially reassured that they were only going to be robbed. Manson apparently took all of the cash in the house, and then Tex took Rosemary to her room, where he tied a pillowcase over her head and gagged her with a lamp cord. A pillowcase was also placed over Lena LaBianca's head, and he was also gagged with a lamp cord. Manson then left, and Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten entered the house. The women were told to go into the room with Rosemary. Tex started stabbing Leno with a bayonet, and he screamed, "Stop stabbing me!" Tex stopped, and then went into the room with Rosemary and then started stabbing her. The women had stabbed Rosemary with knives from the LaBianca kitchen. Tex then went back to stabbing Leno. After the couple were killed, the word "war" was carved into Leno's stomach, and depending on who is telling the story, this was done by either Patricia Krenwinkel or Tex Watson. Personally, I believe it was done by Patricia. The group then wiped the area for prints, and then the words "rise" and "death to pigs" were written in blood on the wall. Patricia also wrote "Helter Skelter" in blood on the fridge. The group then showered together, ate food from the LaBianca fridge, and then changed into some of the clothes that were owned by the LaBiancas. They then left the residence, walking, and then left their bloody clothes in a trash can in front of a random house. The group then hitchhiked back to Spahn Ranch. Virginia Kathleen Brown, better known as Virginia Graham, was born on December 10, 1932, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to parents William and Naomi Brown. Not much is really known about her early life, at least publicly, but at some point she ended up in California and somewhere along the lines became a Hollywood party girl, encountering celebrities like Frank Sinatra and former politicians. Virginia was in the Sybil Brand Institute, a jail, for violating her parole. At the same time, an old friend of hers and previous business associate, Ronnie Howard, was also there. While at Sybil Brand, Virginia worked as a runner carrying messages for the jail authorities. Also working this job was Susan Atkins. While in jail, Susan would do things for attention as mentioned in her own book. Virginia thought of Susan as a lost little girl putting on an act, and she claimed that she actually felt bad for Susan because the other inmates would make fun of her. When Virginia asked Susan what she was in for, Susan replied, "First-degree murder." Virginia couldn't believe it because Susan looked so young. Susan would go on to tell Virginia of the murder she participated in, with details about Gary Hinman's murder, where she described stabbing Hinman like it was a perfectly natural thing to do every day of the week. Most famously, Susan would talk about Sharon Tate's murder. "You know who did it, didn't you?" she said to Virginia, and Virginia replied no. Susan said, "Well, you're looking at her." Susan would go on to describe the events that happened at Cielo Drive and stated that she told the pregnant Sharon Tate, "Look, bitch, I don't care about you. I don't care if you're going to have a baby. You had better be ready. You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." Susan also told Virginia that she had blood in her hand and put it up to her mouth to taste it, saying, "To taste death, yet give life." Wow, what a trip. Virginia would go on to testify at the Tate LaBianca trial for the prosecution, repeating Susan's account to her. In court transcripts, she recalls that Susan said she stabbed Sharon Tate. Virginia went into hiding for some time. She went to Hawaii for a while, then retired in Phoenix, Arizona. On April 17th, 2022, Virginia passed away at the age of 89. She was cremated. Ronnie Howard, also known as Veronica Lopez or Veronica Hughes, was born on May 31st, 1939 in Michigan. Not much is known about her early life, but at some point she ended up in California. At some point in time, she met Virginia Graham and ended up marrying Virginia's second husband. After 1964, they lost touch for some time. By 1969, the two came into contact again, ironically being in jail at the same time at the Sybil Brand Institute. Also there was Susan Atkins. After Susan told Virginia about her crime, she would go on to tell Ronnie Howard also. One day, Susan said that she'd done everything that there was to do, and nothing shocked her anymore. Ronnie replied that nothing shocked her either. Susan then said, "I'll bet I could tell you something that will blow your mind." And Ronnie replied, "Well, I don't think so." And that's when Susan started to tell her about the Tate murders. Susan told Ronnie that Sharon Tate begged, "Please, just let me have my baby." Susan told Sharon Tate, "I have no feelings for you, bitch. You're going to die." Then proceeded to stab her. According to Ronnie Howard's testimony in court, Susan Atkins claimed that she stabbed Sharon Tate in the chest. Susan also told Ronnie that stabbing a person was better than having a climax, that it was a form of sexual release. The more you do it, the better you like it. On September 21st, 1979, after arriving back to LA from Las Vegas, Ronnie was kidnapped by a person claiming to be a taxi driver. She was robbed of about $1,200 worth of assets and beaten with a blunt object, losing consciousness and ending up in a gutter. For several days after this incident, she suffered from nausea, dizziness, headaches, and was becoming increasingly lethargic. On September 25th, she was taken to Queen of Angels Hospital, treated, and released. On October 1st, she couldn't get out of bed and was taken to Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Her eyes were reported as absent. On October 3rd, 1979, Ronnie Howard passed away at 12:30 p.m. from what was brainstem compression, subdural hematoma, cerebral edema, and blunt force trauma. She was 43 years old. Supposedly, her death was not related to her testifying at the Tate LaBianca trial. It should be noted that Susan Atkins sent Ronnie Howard a letter when they were in Sybil Brand Institute that she should have slit Ronnie's throat. The Tate LaBianca trial is quite possibly the most famous part about the Manson family aside of the murders themselves. While the jury was being selected, one person apparently stated, "My God, it's the Manson trial." The jurors would be sequestered for the duration of the trial, which basically means that they would be kept in separate quarters so as not to see media coverage of the case. Those tried in court were Patricia Krenwinkel, who was represented by Paul Fitzgerald, Susan Atkins, who was represented by Day Shin, Leslie Van Houten, who was basically represented by Ronald Hughes, and Charles Manson, who was represented by Irving Kennerek. The trial started in June of 1970, and not long after it began, Manson shaved his head and carved an X into his forehead, with a message sent to the court saying that he X'd himself out of this world. Not long after, the female defendants did the same thing. The trial was drug out much longer than any before and lasted 9 months between the guilt and penalty phases. Irving Kennerek was known for objecting to nearly anything and everything, which you can actually read in the court transcripts. And various people were found in contempt of court, and at one point one lawyer went missing and never came back. Ronald Hughes. Outside the courtroom, the other Manson family members would wait on the corner in a vigil for Charlie's innocence, basically. And they eventually shaved their heads and carved X's into their foreheads, too. At one point, Charles Manson lunged at the judge, though there were multiple times that the defendants would disrupt the trial and have to be taken out of the courtroom. In January of 1971, all of the defendants were found guilty. On April 19, 1971, they were sentenced to death. In 1972, the death penalty was abolished, and so their sentences were commuted to life with the possibility of parole. During the Tate LaBianca trial, there was a part where a few letters from Susan Atkins were to be read in court. There were 3 letters, one that was sent to Ronnie Howard, another to a Joe Stevenson, and the last to a Kit Fletcher. Before they were to be presented in court, they had to be edited. This was because when the way the trial was done, the letters were to only incriminate Susan and none of the other co-defendants. Some of the information deleted from the letters to Joe and Kit was how Susan talked about her karma, and the lawyers decided that they had to delete that term because karma, despite being talked about in Hinduism, was also something that Charles Manson would talk about a lot himself. The line that was deleted went, "It's my karma, a pretty heavy karma at that." Most interestingly, though, was what was deleted in the letter to Ronnie Howard. Many parts to it were deleted, as she referenced Charles Manson multiple times. Some of the lines deleted were, "Yes, I wanted the world to know M." There was a so-called motive behind all this. It was to instill fear into pigs and to bring on Judgment Day, which is here, now, for all. In the word kill, the only thing that dies is the ego. All ego must die anyway. It is written. M does not care. This letter alone seems to prove that Helter Skelter was one of the main reasons that the murders happened. One interesting detail that was actually left in the letter was how Susan stated that she wanted to slit Ronnie Howard's throat. It goes, "When I first heard you were the informer, I wanted to slit your throat. Then I snapped that I was the real informer, and it was my throat I wanted to cut." For some reason, though, Vincent Bugliosi mentions the letters in his book Helter Skelter, but he doesn't include any of the actual text in them at all in the novel. Please note that any of the text that shows on screen for this video is exactly as it was copied in the court transcripts. Susan left grammatical errors. There are multiple crazy moments that happened during the Tate LaBianca trial, but one in particular happened on October 5th, 1970. Right after one witness was called off the stand, Charles Manson asked to examine him, which Judge Older denied. Manson asked again, then was denied again. Manson then said, "You are going to use this courtroom to kill me?" Judge Older then told him that he could step down. Then Manson said, "Are you going to use this courtroom to kill me? Do you want me dead?" And Judge Older exclaimed, "Mr. Manson!" Charlie became more rowdy, and Judge Older told him that he would have him removed if he didn't calm down. Charlie didn't let up and eventually lunged at Judge Older with a pencil. The bailiffs had to wrestle with Charlie, and he yelled out, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off." As this happened, the 3 female defendants started a sing-song chant that was largely unintelligible even to the court reporter. One news article stated that "kill" was constantly repeated. In court transcripts, it was recorded that the women said something along the lines of, "Noam be oro de cayo, noam be oro de cayo, noam be oro de cayo." All of the defendants were then removed from the courtroom, and this all happened in front of the jury, by the way. Surprisingly, Judge Older told the jury to disregard what had happened. And the defense lawyers, of course, tried to push for a mistrial, though this was denied. Judge Older stated, "If he had taken one more step, I would have done something to defend myself." In Bugliosi's book, he stated, Manson continued to fight even after he had been taken into lockup, and it took 4 men to put cuffs on him. After the incident, Judge Older began wearing a .38 caliber revolver under his robes, both in court and in the chambers. The helter-skelter theory is the motive that was used at the Tate LaBianca trial to convict Charles Manson and his 3 co-defendants. The main idea of the motive was that the victims were murdered to bring down helter-skelter, a race war that was to happen between blacks and whites. In court, Greg Jacobson stated that Manson believed helter-skelter was imminent and would start by white families being cut up and dismembered and so on. The open confrontation would be in the streets and the blacks would win. Manson's idea was that Whitey's karma would have turned, that it was time for them to take place of Whitey. Meanwhile, Manson and his followers would be able to avoid this race war by going out into the desert. Greg Jacobson stated that Manson firmly believed that there was a bottomless pit in the Death Valley area that could be lived in and inhabited. While in the pit, the cult would grow to 144,000, like in the Bible. Manson also apparently believed that the black man would win the race war, and he thought that they wouldn't be able to handle it, as the establishment was a creation of the white man. The idea then was that blacks would give the reins of power back to any whites that survived helter-skelter, and these whites would of course be out in the desert, which would be Manson and his followers. Paul Watkins stated in court that Charlie would scratch the black man's fuzzy head and kick him in the butt and tell him to go pick cotton and go be a good N-word, and he would live happily ever after. The White Album by the Beatles was believed by Manson as apparently prophesizing helter-skelter through the lyrics in their songs. Such songs as Revolution 9, Sexy Sadie, Piggies, and Helter Skelter were among the songs that Greg Jacobson said Manson listened to most. After the Tate LaBianca murders, many people have wondered why the murders occurred. One of the main reasons people believe the murders at Cielo Drive happened, at least, is because 10,050 Cielo Drive was Terry Melcher's previous residence. Charles Manson was once buddies with Dennis Wilson and, by extension, sort of Terry Melcher. In Jeff Gein's book Manson, Melcher would participate in intercourse with some of the Manson women, one of them notably being Ruth Ann Morehouse, who was underage. Diane Lake's book states that Manson recorded with the Beach Boys, but because of Manson's refusal to accept any criticism, his musical ventures basically went nowhere. Still, various accounts from other Manson family members stated that Terry made promises to them that he never fulfilled. Paul Watkins' book also stated about a time where Melcher was supposed to come by and listen to them audition, but he never showed up. To quote, he said, Charlie wanted Terry Melcher, the owner of a record company, to come and hear us at Gresham Street. All we need is a chance. One break and we get this album together. It's gonna happen, man. When Terry Melcher didn't show up, Charlie was seething. Charlie said that Melcher's word wasn't worth a plugged nickel. In Tex Watson's book, he wrote, Terry, Charlie told us, had made him some big promises and then never came through. Terry didn't care about anything but money. Gradually, it seemed clearer and clearer, at least to us, that Terry Melcher was the one who had failed Charlie, who had led him along and then betrayed him and kept his music from the world. In her story to the news, Susan Atkins stated that the reason Charlie picked the house was to instill fear into Terry Melcher because Terry had given his word on a few things and never came through with them. Some people believe that the motive for the Tate LaBianca murders was basically that they were copycat killings. Before the murders at Cielo and Waverly Drive, first was the murder of Gary Hinman in July of 1969. Gary was murdered by Bobby Beausoleil, and not long after, Bobby was caught and placed into jail. The idea of the copycat motive is that the Tate LaBianca murders were to make police think that there was no way Bobby could have killed Gary because they clearly had the wrong guy since the true killer was on the loose. Interestingly, Aaron Stovitz, who was the original partner attorney to Vincent Bugliosi on the trial, had actually thought of this as a potential motive. In the book Helter Skelter, Vincent Bugliosi stated this was bogus. The idea wasn't brought up in the trial until the penalty phase, after Manson and the others had actually already been convicted in court. By the time this was brought up in court, all the jury had to do was determine whether to give them life in prison or the death penalty. Bugliosi asked Catherine Scher in court, "Why haven't you come forward before today to tell the authorities about this conversation you had with Linda Kasabian?" She replied, "I didn't want anything to do with it. I don't believe in coming to you at all." The book then goes on to say, earlier on cross-examination, Gypsy had admitted that she loved Manson and she would willingly die for him. After reminding her of these statements, I said, Bugliosi, "All right, and you believe he had nothing to do with these murders, right?" And Catherine said, "Right." Bugliosi stated, "And yet you let him stay in jail all these months without coming forward with this valuable information?" And apparently Catherine Scher evaded a straight reply. In Susan Atkins' book, she put emphasis on the murders being copycat killings to free Bobby. Tex Watson also says this, where it's quoted, "There is a third, less important purpose: to clear Bobby Beausoleil of the Hinman slaying by committing a similar crime while he was in jail." Helter Skelter is a true crime book written by Vincent Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry, released in 1974. The book describes in meticulous detail the investigation of the Tate LaBianca murders and Bugliosi's time in interviewing those involved with the Manson family and the trial which it followed. Bugliosi was the prosecutor for the case. Though it's not a perfect book, the book is commonly thought of as the go-to piece of reference material about Charles Manson and the Manson family. Depending on what version of the book you come across and the physical size of it, it can range from 500 to 700 pages. The book is laid out in chronological order from the events of the murders at Cielo Drive and the next night at Waverly Drive, all the way through the arduous trial. There is a plethora of people mentioned, talked about, and interviewed through the course of the book, and Bugliosi seems to have done a good job in describing the people in an understandable format. Even still, there are still errors within the book that have been pointed out in the decades since. One of them just being that he messed up the license plate numbers, switching Stephen Parent's and Sharon Tate's license plate numbers for some reason. The main focus of the book seems to be about the trial, of course. Reading through the trial transcripts and Helter Skelter at the same time, it's clear that Bugliosi depended on that portion heavily for the trial portion of the book. What's strange, though, is how certain parts about the race war theory that would have made his book more believable were left out, such as Susan Atkins' letter to Ronnie Howard, where she wrote, "There was a so-called motive for all this. It was to instill fear into pigs and to bring on Judgment Day, which is here now for all." Even still, despite its errors, Helter Skelter went on to become the best-selling true crime novel of all time. Helter Skelter is a 1976 made-for-TV movie that is based off of the 1974 book of the same name. The movie was apparently also shown in cinemas. At 3 hours long, though apparently some news articles stated it was 4 hours, it was shown on TV in 2 parts, with the first part ending as Bugliosi's watch stops when making eye contact with Manson. In an interview years later, Bugliosi said that, the producers dramatized that a bit. Though the movie follows the book closely, certain things had to be mushed together, obviously, for the sake of time. One example of this was when Bugliosi talks about exterminants and the fifth beetle. In the book, this was part of two separate conversations, one with Greg Jacobson and another with Paul Watkins. In the movie, this all happens with Paul Watkins. Various real names were slightly changed, likely to protect the identities of the real-life counterparts. Some of the actors also looked completely different from their real-life versions, one example being Ronnie Howard. Interestingly, Virginia Graham is not depicted in the movie at all. Manson is played by Steve Railsback, who does a really great impression of him. The movie even recreates the moment in court when Manson lunged at Judge Older, which actually happened in real life. There is also a recreation of the moment when Charlie held up the newspaper, "Manson guilty," Nixon declares, which happened too. The film depicts the disappearance of Ronald Hughes, who has a different name in the movie, as all the defense lawyers did. And apparently, according to news articles, the movie cost $1.4 million to make. And one article stated that some of the crew received strange phone calls during filming. The film ends bringing up how all of the Manson family members would be eligible for parole in 1978, which was just barely 2 years after this was released. Today, though, the film seems to be rather rare to find, at least in physical copies. Spahn Ranch was the main area that the Manson family lived in before their eventual dissolve after the Tate LaBianca trial. It was located in Chatsworth, California. Before their use of it, though, it had multiple uses such as a ranch, a dairy farm, and for a short time was a movie set for various Western films and TV shows. By the time the Manson family decided to use it, the owner, George Spahn, had set it up to rent horses, and it was pretty much dead. Because George Spahn was elderly and blind, he had multiple hired hands to help out on the property. One of the main reasons that Charlie and the Manson family were allowed to stay at the ranch was because they would help out with the place, though they weren't perfect. Even still, in books from Paul Watkins and Squeaky Fromies, for example, they talked about shoveling manure, cooking for Spahn, and working on some of the structures. Even still, there were people who didn't tolerate or like the Manson family at Spahn Ranch because they brought trouble. Susan Atkins claims in her book that she was the one that helped find the place for the family to move into. In Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, he states that the Manson women would engage in intercourse with George Spahn, though Squeaky Fromy refutes this in her book. After the Tate LaBianca murders, Spahn Ranch was raided by authorities in what was one of the largest raids in California history for its time. Ironically, those arrested were actually released due to an error in the warrant issued. The ranch would also be the place that Shorty Shea would be murdered and his remains were buried until they were found in December of 1977. In 1970, Spahn Ranch burned down after a wildfire called the Clampett Fire broke out. George Spahn himself passed away in 1974. Barker Ranch was one of the secondary locations that the Manson family was located at during their time together. It is located in Death Valley, California. Charles Manson first learned about Barker Ranch thanks to Catherine Gillies, whose grandmother owned that ranch and the nearby Myers Ranch. Manson asked for permission to stay there, though Arlene Barker wasn't aware of how many people would be with him. Charlie would give Arlene Barker some flowers and a gold record by the Beach Boys as a way to show that he was a musician that needed a quiet place to create. Various sources state that the ranch was hard and still is pretty hard to locate, as it's surrounded by rugged terrain. Many believe that many of the reasons why Manson decided to locate himself there was because it was physically hard to find, and especially for authorities. Paul Watkins described the location as a low-slung dwelling secluded behind a strand of wind-blown cottonwoods and fronted by a grape vineyard. His book said, At the time we arrived, it was in a general state of disrepair, and the vineyards had all gone to seed. In general, the Barker place was funkier, more weather-beaten, and somehow more conducive to the scene we had going. Barker would also be a waypoint or checkpoint for the Manson family when they would travel to Las Vegas. Ironically, the terrain to entering the ranch from the Nevada side was easier to travel than from the California side. In October of 1969, Barker Ranch was raided over a course of multiple days after the Manson family had vandalized some government equipment, mainly among some other things. Unbeknownst to the authorities at the time, they had arrested a group of murderers connected to, at the time, what was the most popular murder in the news. Among those arrested were Kitty Lutzinger and Stephanie Schramm, who actually asked for authorities for protection. In 1976, the ranch became a part of the California Desert Conservation Area, and today it is a part of the National Park Service. On October 10, 1969, Barker Ranch was raided by police. Steve Grogan was one of the first arrests, and then after that, Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, Catherine Scher, Susan Atkins, and Squeaky Fromme were among the next arrested. Susan and Sandra Good's sons were found at the ranch. Law enforcement found weapons, gas, and a little bit of food. 11 vehicles were found, and out of those, 8 were stolen. Those arrested were taken to Independence, California, which was the county seat for Inyo County. Charlie was then notified of the raid, and he spent October 11th apparently getting money, and then went to Barker Ranch and gathered Bruce Davis, Diane Lake, and a few others. For whatever reason unknown, Manson decided to stay at the ranch. Meanwhile, police realized that none of the people they arrested were Manson, who was the main one they were looking for. So they returned back to Barker Ranch on October 12th. Law enforcement burst through the back door of the main building, and they found several people at the kitchen table, and everyone obeyed. One officer named Purcell found a candle and used it to look around a tiny bathroom. He noticed that there were some hairs poking out of this closed, tiny cabinet, and as small as it was, it turned out that there was somebody in there. As the door started to open, Purcell said, "If you make one false move, I'll blow your head off." The man that emerged said, "Hi," in a tone that was recalled as polite as can be, and of course, this was Charles Manson. Charlie was then cuffed and put in a truck bed with the others. 3 more people were picked up along the way, and everyone was sent to Inyo County Jail. It would be the last time that Charles Manson would be free ever again. Lie, the Love and Terror Cult, is the first album released by Charles Manson, released on March 6, 1970. The album art is an altered image of what was originally the cover for a 1969 December Life magazine issue, though the original photo itself of Manson is from actually an arrest when the Manson family was arrested for sleeping in a public park, as is talked about in Diane Lake's book. The album, though, was recorded for the most part in 1968, though the song Six City was recorded in 1967. The original release of the album was pressed on vinyl through Phil Kaufman, who was pretty much an old prison buddy of Manson's. After being arrested for the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson would call Kaufman about 5 times a week, asking him to put out his music. Even though 2,000 copies of the album were made, supposedly 300 were sold, as it says on Wikipedia, though a news article I found stated that 750 were sold. Articles from 1970 show that the album was only available through mail, which you had to write through a P.O. box, and they cost $4.50 each. The money was to go towards the defense fund for the Manson family members on trial. One person even sent in $200 with the message that said, "You are the scum of the sewers." On the original pressings of the album, there was apparently an interview with Manson printed on the back. As apparently Phil Kaufman never made back his investment, he signed an agreement with the label ESP Disc to sell the album internationally. While the original print of the vinyl had 13 songs on it, a 2006 re-release issued 12 extra tracks, including an audio interview with Manson. All proceeds from this album were to go towards Wojtek Frykowski's son. The album itself has a folk music type of sound, with the talent of various family members on it, including Paul Watkins, Lynette Fromme, Mary Brunner, and Bobby Beausoleil. Various songs on it have been covered over the decades from various musicians. On Charles Manson's album Lie, you can hear the song Cease to Exist. This was the original version to what became the more popularly known song Never Learn Not to Love by the Beach Boys. It should be noted, though, that the Beach Boys released their version of the song first on December 2nd, 1968, though it seems that Manson recorded Cease to Exist first. Before the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson befriended one of the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson, various sources have talked about. They have also stated that the Manson family took advantage of Dennis Wilson's kindness and cost about $100,000 worth of expenses for that time, though adjusted for inflation, that would be about $968,000 in 2026, nearly $1 million. Despite all of this, Dennis Wilson still seemed to believe in Charlie's musical ability. The song Cease to Exist was originally written by Manson after apparently seeing some sort of conflict between two of the Wilson brothers. The song was partially to bring the brothers together, though it also has the perspective of a man talking to a woman. Dennis seemed to like the song, and he presented it to the others in the Beach Boys, though apparently he didn't originally disclose who wrote it. The Beach Boys decided to make the song their own, with Manson exchanging any writing credit for a sum of money and a motorcycle. When asked why Manson didn't receive any credit, Dennis Wilson stated that Charlie didn't want it, but wanted money instead. Wilson stated that he gave Manson about $100,000 worth of stuff, though it's unknown if this is an additional $100,000 to the original that the family racked up. On the other hand, though, it is quoted that Stephen Desper, who was the band engineer for the Beach Boys, stated, "If Manson had been a decent person, the Beach Boy organization would have given him credit and treasure as they did with other writers. But Manson was a thief and did not play by civil rules. By those rules, he was compensated as far as they were concerned." After the Tate LaBianca trial, the interest in Charles Manson and the Manson family seemed to grow among the public instead of wane. This seems most apparent in pieces of music especially. While this is of course not a comprehensive video, here are some instances of this. For example, Manson is mentioned multiple times in Phil Anselmo's music, in songs such as Uplift and Message in Blood with the band Pantera. In Superjoint Ritual, the songs Creepy Crawl and Dress Like a Target mention the Manson family. In the band Down, Where I'm Going mentions Charlie directly on their album Down 2. There are also older photos of Phil Anselmo, mainly from the Pantera years, where he could be seen wearing shirts that had Charlie's face on them. The band I Hate God also has made references towards Manson, especially on their first album In the Name of Suffering. Pigs is a reference to the writing on the walls that the Manson family left at the crime scenes. God's Song also has pretty much quotes from Manson from a 1988 interview that he did with Geraldo Rivera. According to the book, The Long Prison Journey of Leslie Van Houten, Carleen Faith wrote that the song Native Dancer was influenced by Leslie Van Houten, though this seems to be the only source of this. The musician who made Native Dancer is Chris Williamson. Of course, G.G. Allin actually covered Charlie's song Garbage Dump on his 1987 release, You Give Love a Bad Name. And probably most popularly, I would think, is Guns N' Roses, who covered Manson's song Look at Your Game Girl on their 1993 album The Spaghetti Incident. It caused a lot of controversy at the time, and people felt like the band was glorifying Manson. All royalties of this song were donated to the Doris Tate Crime Victims Bureau. There were also pictures from around that time period where Axl Rose could be seen wearing a shirt that said, "Charlie don't surf." And interestingly, Charlie actually mentions Guns N' Roses and this cover that happened in his 1997 parole hearing. After being convicted at the Tate LaBianca trial, Susan Atkins would take to creating pieces of art and jewelry when she was in prison. Even though her book, Child of Satan, Child of God, stated that she liked to write, there really doesn't seem to be any publicly available pieces of literature that she's ever created, other than the book. When the internet came around, though, her husband, James Whitehouse, had maintained a website for her. One of the parts of the site showed various pieces of art that she created. Surprisingly, she was quite talented, actually, and paintings of flowers and her surroundings were mostly shown. Other pieces of art that Susan created were jewelry, which seemed to be mostly rings, at least from pictures shown. In the Manson family, one of the ways they would get food would be going on garbage runs. In Helter Skelter, Susan Atkins was quoted as having said, "The supermarkets all over Los Angeles throw away perfectly good food every day. Fresh vegetables and sometimes cartons of eggs, packages of cheese that are stamped to a certain date, but the food is still good." In Jeff Gein's book, he wrote that Manson learned of the idea from a group called the Diggers in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. Charlie taught the others in his group to scrounge for what was left and thrown around in dumpsters. Gein's book also said, "Sometimes some of the women would put on regular clothes and go to food stores, identifying as Girl Scout leaders, to ask for donations for snacks. Other times, group members would volunteer as stall assistants at farmers markets. At the end of the day, they would be given whatever fruits or vegetables hadn't been sold and weren't fresh enough to offer to the public again the next day." In Squeaky Frommy's book, she wrote, "We girls crept behind Malibu's markets. We spied things worth a climb inside. Crates of fresh fruits of which some, but not all, had bruises or spots. It was good, nutritious food, and there was only one reason much of it had been tossed away. People didn't want to buy a small stalk of celery or tomato with a bruise. They wanted picture-perfect goods and left the crooked carrots to us. We were continually surprised by what we found. Sealed blocks of cheese with a few tiny specks of mold, misprinted packages of such things as crackers and pasta. We brought it home and washed it thoroughly. We had real butter, bread, and crisp salads. We came to believe that you could have fed the world with just America's garbage." On Manson's album Lie, there's actually a song about this which is called Garbage Dump. Interestingly, though, Lino LaBianca, one of the victims to the crimes, was the president of Gateway Markets, a supermarket chain. How tall was Charles Manson anyway? In Vincent Bugliosi's book, he claimed that Charles Manson was 5'2". But was this an accurate description of him? There are various arrest pictures that don't seem to help either. In one popular photo of Charles Manson wearing his buckskin outfit, he's next to a ruler that seems to measure him at about 5'2" or 5'3". Yet in various arrest photos, his height can be seen as 5'7". In Paul Watkins' 1979 book, My Life with Charles Manson, he also claims that Manson was small, but he says that Manson was eye to eye with him and around the same height. For reference, Paul Watkins was 5'5". In Susan Atkins' 1977 book, Child of Satan, Child of God, she claims that Manson was taller than her at 5'7". Susan was about 5'3". In George Stimson's book, Goodbye Helter Skelter, Stimson provides a photo of himself with Manson. He claims that Charlie wasn't 5'2", though on the smaller side. But for reference, George Stimson is 6'3". In parole hearings, Charlie would comment about the odd height discrepancy. At the end of one hearing, he stated that he was 5'6".
Yeah.
Everybody says I'm 5'2". When I was arrested, I was 5'7". Then I went down to 5'6". Then I went down to 5 foot. Then I went to 4 feet. Now I'm down to 5'2". Pretty soon I'll be 5 feet. By the time that you all die, I'll be about 3 feet tall.
So how tall are you, Charlie?
5'6".
Okay.
And 3/4.
Did you know that convicted serial killer Tex Watson went on to have a family in prison? Tex Watson, the man who murdered the pregnant actress Sharon Tate, along with 6 other people, was able to father 4 children after being sent to prison. In 1979, Tex married a woman who became the mother of his children. She claimed that she met Tex after deciding to travel to California after reading his book, Will You Die For Me, which was released in 1978 and talked about his conversion to Christianity. After the murders, of course. What's interesting is that in a 1981 parole hearing, apparently Tex Watson left the room weeping after one of the members of the parole board asked him what he would do if someone murdered his then pregnant wife. In 1992, a film called Pardoned from Above was released, and it talked about how Tex was forgiven for his crimes thanks to Christianity. There were scenes in there about his wife, and they also show 3 of the children they had at that point. She stated that the support of a husband was something that she would constantly think about having at home. The couple would end up having their 4th child after the 1992 film was released. Will You Die For Me is a book by Charles Tex Watson and Chaplain Ray Hoekstra, and it was originally released in 1978. The book talks a little bit about Tex Watson's early life, and from what we are able to read, he seemed to have a normal childhood. The book isn't very long at all. It is available online from Watson's own Christian Ministries website, Abounding Love, and the PDF to it is only about 120 pages long. Watson starts off the story with a scene of him in the desert with Manson and the other family members, with Charlie pointing a knife at Watson's chest. Apparently he asked him, "Will you die for me, Tex? Will you let me kill you?" And Tex Watson says, "Sure, Charlie, you can kill me." Watson claimed in his book that he thought Manson was God to him. After the knife episode, Watson called his mother and said to her, "Well, I've met that Jesus you preach about all the time. I've met him, and he's here right now with me in the desert." Watson's book goes on to talk about his time with the Manson family and how he actually left for a little bit of time. Interestingly, Watson goes on to admit to becoming a drug dealer in the story and ingesting various amounts of drugs. At one point, he even ingested some sort of concoction of belladonna root that was cooked by other family member Nancy Pittman. At this point, that is usually credited when Watson seems to have lost his mind, which is potentially true. After taking the belladonna root, he was found slithering on the sidewalk in front of children and was arrested for that. Tex's account of the Tate LaBianca murders glosses over many of the details, and he called Sharon Tate a pathetic blonde woman. He recalled Wojtek Frykowski's confusion when Tex entered the residence, and in the book he told Frykowski, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." At the LaBianca house, Tex stated that he saw Manson in his mind telling him to kill. Despite the lack of compassion for his victims, he expressed how badly he felt for Diane Lake. Kind of strange that a serial killer could actually feel bad for someone. Watson ended up converting to Christianity in 1975, and his book has a pardon section, like as if he almost hoped to be pardoned by the governor or president for his crimes. The book ends with Steps to Receiving Christ as Your Savior, which was very similar to Susan Atkins' own book, Child of Satan, Child of God. who also converted to Christianity around the same time in the 70s. Child of Satan, Child of God is a book by Manson family member Susan Atkins, which was released in 1977. The book is a very sanitized version of her version of events that led her to eventually meeting Charles Manson and participating in the murders at 10,050 Cielo Drive and also the Gary Hinman murder. While it tells some interesting information about Susan's early life, such as the death of her mother, there are many events that are not discussed completely. One example is how she traveled to Oregon with two ex-cons, and they actually ended up stealing a car to do so. In her book, she completely omits the fact that she told the police, "I should have killed you," when she was arrested. This is something that could be read in court transcripts and parole transcripts for her. The book goes on to admit other things which only make Susan look worse and not better. For example, when she was pregnant, she admitted to taking LSD and smoking pot to the point where even Charles Manson told her to basically cool down for the sake of the baby. But she continued to use drugs anyway. Unsurprisingly, Susan's son was born prematurely by 2 months, and he was only 2 pounds. Susan never mentions or even seems to think about the irony about her giving birth and then a year later participating in the murder of a pregnant woman. Susan's account of the murders at Cielo Drive are also sanitized and omits many of the real details. In the book, she stated that she didn't kill or stab the pregnant actress Sharon Tate, though she admitted to telling Sharon, "Shut up, bitch, you're going to die." Even this is an abbreviation about what she really said, as in court transcripts from the trial show that Susan taunted the pregnant Tate, even telling her that she didn't care that she was pregnant, despite Sharon's pleas to have her baby. The most surprising part of all is how Susan admitted to lacking any remorse for any of the victims for the crimes. She even made it seem like her crimes were forgiven thanks to her conversion to Christianity. A strange book that in the decades since hasn't been taken too seriously. Many people have thought that it was all done to help her gain parole, which, of course, thankfully, she never got. My Life with Charles Manson is a book written by Paul Watkins, another Manson family member, and it was released in 1979. The book is an account of Paul's experiences with Charles Manson and the Manson family and the events that led to the Tate LaBianca murders. Watkins claims that he was Charles Manson's number 2 man, though this seems to be the only piece of literature throughout the Manson universe that seems to claim this. It can be argued that Bruce Davis or Tex Watson, the man that actually killed the majority of the people at the Tate LaBianca murders, either of those people could have actually been Manson's second-hand man. Various memories are recalled, such as an LSD freakout, where many of the Manson family members started chanting, "Charlie, Charlie," over and over again. In fact, at one point, Watkins himself ends up holding his own genitals and asking, "Can't we just make love?" He also recalled the sexual attractiveness of nearly every female mentioned in the Manson family, calling some corpulent or fat, and another a cosmic sex cookie. He also mentioned having a crush on Diane Lake, who, in her book decades later, barely mentions Paul Watkins at all. The book also recalls the time that Paul and Steve Grogan crashed Dennis Wilson's car, stating that the reason they probably survived the crash was because Clem was too dodoed out to get snuffed. He also talked about Susan Atkins giving birth to her child prematurely, and here in this book it's revealed that apparently Paul and Charles Manson thought up the name Zizo Zay Zadfrak that was used for Susan's baby. Susan would end up losing custody of her child actually before the murders, but of course permanently after the murders, and apparently in foster care he was renamed to Paul. Watkins, though, would go on to defect from the Manson family along with Brooks Poston, and they would live in the desert with a man named Paul Crockett. Crockett was credited as the main person to help Watkins and Poston to start to see through Charles Manson's philosophy. The book ends with Paul testifying in court against Manson, stating that the truth will set you free. Paul Watkins, though, himself passed away in 1990 due to cancer. There do not seem to be any reprints of this book, and today it is rare to come across any physical copies of it. Member of the Family is a book by former Manson family member Diane Lake, and it was published in 2017. The book is a recollection of her early life and, of course, the events that led her to meeting Charles Manson. It's not solely about her time with Manson, with the first half of the book dealing very much with her early childhood and her parents' troubled relationship. Her father was described as an artist that was restless and wasn't very happy with suburban life, and her mother was much more balanced and a typical Midwestern suburban mom. Diane revealed that she was touched by her grandfather when visiting him one time. At one point, Diane's father started to cheat on her mother, and eventually he left his family and moved with his mistress to California. This resulted in Diane's mother working to support her family, and for a while there was more stability for them. But eventually her parents reunited and the whole family moved out to California. Her father, who she goes on to just call Clarence after he cheated on her mom, became interested in the counterculture and writers like Timothy Leary. She even recalled that it was her parents that first introduced her to smoking marijuana. As her parents became more engulfed in the counterculture, they started to act more burdened by her. They eventually gave her a signed letter, which was to pretty much give her permission to do whatever she wanted. Of course, there was no legality to this. Not long after having trouble at Wavy Gravy's hog farm commune, Diane left to live with a couple, and then eventually she met the Manson family. She recalled that the girls like Squeaky Fromy seemed very excited to meet her at first, and she felt a lot more welcome with them than her own actual parents. Despite being the interest of Charles Manson for a short period of time, he proved to be violent, and she recalled that he even raped her at one point. Diane wrote about how he would often hit her. Despite his attempts to drop her off at various areas, she would still run back to him. After the murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, Diane stated that she saw Leslie Van Houten return to Spawn Ranch early the next morning. She would go on to be a witness for the prosecution, her account being what helped convict Leslie Van Houten. After the trial, she would go on to have a family, putting that time of her life behind her. Reflection is a book by Squeaky Fromy, which was released in 2018. It talks about Squeaky's time with Charles Manson, though it doesn't speak much about the Tate LaBianca murders, nor her attempted assassination of President Gerald Ford. Despite the beautiful imagery portrayed in the book, admittedly, Squeaky's writing could actually be beautiful. It seemed more like a coming-of-age book for her than bringing up any actual useful information for the most part. Squeaky recalled her time with Charlie fondly, and even revealed that she had gotten pregnant by him at one point, though this resulted in a miscarriage. Even still, it seemed clear that Squeaky was definitely one of Charles Manson's favorite girls. The book also has excerpts from other Manson family members, namely Sandra Good, though from some other people, including a couple of excerpts from Charles himself. It's here, though, that we see some insight into Sandra's own upbringing, such as the turbulent relationship between her own parents and their breakup. It's also revealed that Sandra had most of one lung removed, and she would question the necessity of that procedure. What was interesting was how Sandra revealed that it was Charlie that convinced her to go off of birth control. Of course, not long after, she would conceive a child with Bobby Beausoleil. One thing I did like is that Squeaky's book brought up more information about Mary Bruner and the birth of Charlie's third child. This was done possibly more than any other book before it. This is potentially the only book, so far at least, that gives more insight about Mary Bruner as a person and her characteristics. There was much more emphasis on the nature aspects and how important it was to Charlie and some of the others. Many of the reflections in the book speak of their time in the forest by the trees and even commented on the social justice obsessed at colleges like Berkeley. Interestingly, this book corroborates the LSD freakout that was remembered by Paul Watkins in his book, My Life with Charles Manson. Squeaky and Sandra Good both recall the scenario, even remembering how Paul held his genitals and said, "Can't we just make love?" The book ends with only a little blurb about the situation with President Ford and how Squeaky said that the gun did not go off. The Long Prison Journey of Leslie Van Houten is a book written by Carlene Faith and is basically an opinion piece about Leslie. Carlene met Leslie after Leslie had been convicted and sent to CIW, the California Institute for Women, and was on SSU, what used to be the death row. After being on SSU, the inmates were allowed to gain an education, and Carlene was one of the professors. Carlene would offer her classes to Leslie, Patricia, and Susan Atkins. While the book is interesting in some ways, the main idea of the book was basically just to vouch for Leslie's release. Carlene's main contention was really that Leslie had served enough time in prison already. At the time of the book's release, Leslie had done about 30 years. The book also talks about how Leslie was released for a short bit of time in the 1970s when she had her retrials, and actually Leslie had lived with Carlene for a little bit. Even though the argument for Leslie's release was made by many people over the decades, Carlene's arguments for the book were honestly quite weak. She basically just said that Leslie was brainwashed, and that should have been a good enough reason for Leslie to have been let go. The book actually seemed quite biased in many ways, as of course Carlene had befriended Leslie, and much of the book just appears as, "Let her go, she's my friend." The book would go on to be the inspiration for the movie Charlie Says, which came out in 2018. Ironically, the book and the movie seem to make Leslie's chances for parole actually harder. In parole transcripts after the book and the movie were released through that about 10-year period, people at the parole hearings would question Leslie if these things were made to help her gain any sort of money or fame, which she would say no. Despite Leslie not writing the book or having made the movie, she still actually seemed to be punished for both. Carlene Faith, the author, would pass away in 2017 before Leslie would be released. Van Houten was released on parole in 2023, and she completed her sentence in 2025.